Ethan Cole had already agreed to leave. That was the part no one behind the counter seemed to notice. Deputy Caleb Turner stood close to him, sunglasses pushed up into his hair, one hand resting near the cuffs on his belt, not touching them, just close enough that Ethan understood the message. Richard Ferris watched from behind the register, arms folded, satisfied in the quiet way of a man who believes a problem is finally being handled correctly. Ethan reached down and touched the harness clipped along Mara's back. "We're leaving," he said to her, low and even. Mara rose from beneath the booth and took 2 steps toward the door. Then she stopped, not slowed. Stopped the way a leash goes taut against a wall. Her nose lifted, turned, and locked toward the corridor that led past the kitchen to the rear of the building. Her body went rigid, weight shifted low, ears forward. The leash pulled straight in Ethan's hand. Something in his chest changed before his mind caught up to it, the old, familiar drop of adrenaline he had not felt in years outside of memory. "Hold on," Ethan said. Caleb's hand moved half an inch closer to his cuffs. "Sir, we talked about this. She has an explosive odor," Ethan said. Quiet, precise, not raising his voice at all. "Give me 60 seconds. Less than a minute earlier, Caleb had been ready to walk a decorated veteran and his dog out of a diner for the crime of eating breakfast. Before that minute ended, that same dog would be the only reason anyone inside had enough time to get out. 20 minutes before any of that, the day had started as nothing more than a truck stop off a 2-lane highway in North Carolina, heat already rising off the parking lot, and a bell over a glass door that gave a small, tired ring when Ethan pushed it open. Pine Ridge Diner smelled like it always smelled at that hour. Coffee left too long on the burner, griddle grease, the particular staleness of an air conditioner working against July. Vinyl booths lined the windows. Metal blinds threw thin bars of light across the tabletops. Somewhere behind the pass-through window, a bell rang twice for an order coming up. Ethan chose a booth near the back corner, close enough to see the entrance, his back against the wall, room enough beneath the table for a 90-pound German Shepherd to lie down without being seen by anyone walking past. He did this without thinking about it. He had done it for 18 years, long enough that the choice no longer felt like a choice at all, just the shape a room took when he walked into it. He had spent most of those years in naval special warfare before retiring as a senior chief, and some habits from that career had simply never been asked to leave. A handful of customers were scattered through the diner, an older couple sharing a plate of eggs near the window, 2 men in work boots arguing quietly over a football score, a silver-haired man at the counter nursing black coffee and reading a folded newspaper he wasn't in any hurry to finish. None of them looked up when the bell rang. None of them would have any reason to remember Ethan walking in, not yet. Mara settled beneath the table, chin on her paws, and closed her eyes. Her harness sat low across her chest, faded at the edges from years of wear that had nothing to do with the psychiatric work she did now. Ethan rested one hand briefly against her back before reaching for the laminated menu propped between the ketchup and the napkin dispenser. It was a small habit, barely a gesture, the kind of contact that told her nothing was wrong and everything was where it should be. A young woman in an apron approached with 2 menus and a coffee pot, her name tag reading Emily. She saw the dog before she saw the harness, and her expression shifted. Not to fear exactly, more like uncertainty looking for permission to become something else. Can that be in here? "She's a trained service dog," Ethan said, keeping his voice even. "She performs tasks related to a disability. She'll stay under the table and won't bother anyone." Emily glanced down at Mara, who had not moved, had not sniffed the air near the table, had not so much as lifted her head. "Okay," Emily said, though it came out more like a question than an answer. "I'll get you some coffee." She walked away quickly, and a moment later Ethan saw her lean toward the register, speaking to a man in a collared shirt with a laminated Pine Ridge Diner badge clipped to his pocket. Richard Ferris looked over once, set down the receipt tape he had been checking, and came around the counter with the particular walk of a man who has already decided what he is going to say. "Morning," Ferris said, stopping at the edge of the booth. That's a big dog you've got there. She's a service dog, Ethan said. Trained. She'll stay under the table. I hear you, Ferris said, but I've got a health code responsibility here. Animals aren't allowed in a food service area. That's not me being difficult. That's the county. Service animals are an exception under the ADA, Ethan said. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking you to follow the law that already applies. Ferris's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. I get people telling me that a lot, he said. Emotional support animals, comfort animals, whatever people call them these days. Are you actually disabled? Or is this more of a preference? You can ask whether she's required because of a disability, Ethan said, still calm. You can ask what task she's trained to perform. That's the full extent of it. You can't ask me to describe or prove the disability itself, and you can't ask for a diagnosis. I'm not trying to be difficult, Ferris said, in the tone of a man who believed the sentence excused whatever came before it. I've got a business to run. People see a dog that size lying under a table where they're eating breakfast, and some of them are going to have a problem with it. That's not me. That's just how people are. Then ask me the two questions the law actually allows, Ethan said. I'll answer both. She's required because of a disability, and she's trained to interrupt panic episodes, create space around me in crowded places, and guide me toward an exit if I need one. Ferris studied him for a moment, arms folding tighter across his chest. You don't have paperwork? A certificate? A vest with some kind of ID number? There's no legal requirement for a certificate, Ethan said. You're welcome to look it up. What matters is her training and her behavior, and you can see her behavior right now. Ferris glanced down. Mara had not moved. He looked back up anyway, unconvinced, as though the dog's stillness was itself suspicious. I've got other customers to think about, Ferris said. Somebody's going to complain about a dog that size sitting under a table where they eat. I can't have that. She needs to wait outside, or you'll need to take your meal to go. No one's complained, Ethan said. No one but you. I'm the one responsible for this place, Ferris said. Not the customers. Something small moved under the table. Mara's nose lifted an inch, turned toward the kitchen corridor, held there a beat, then settled again. Ethan noticed. He did not act on it. It was not yet anything more than a dog registering a smell in a diner full of smells, kitchen exhaust and bleach and old grease and whatever else came and went through a rear door propped open for deliveries. He had learned, over years of watching her work, not to chase every flicker of her attention as though it meant something. Dogs noticed things constantly. Alerts were rare on purpose, trained to be rare, so that when one came, it could actually be trusted. He kept his eyes on Ferris instead, and on the argument that hadn't stopped just because Mara's attention had briefly wandered. I'm not going to argue health code with you, Ethan said. I'm telling you what the law allows, and I'm asking you to follow it. And I'm telling you, Ferris said, that if she's not leaving, you might need to. Emily hovered near the coffee station, refilling a mug that didn't need refilling, close enough to hear. When Ferris turned back toward the register, she leaned toward Ethan's booth just slightly. He does this, she said, quiet, almost embarrassed. Makes people feel like they did something wrong just for asking. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize for him, Ethan said. I need this job, Emily said, and stepped back before anything else could be said. Ferris was already at the register with the phone against his ear. Yeah, this is Richard over at Pine Ridge, off Route 9, he said. I've got a customer refusing to remove a large dog from the dining area. It's starting to become a disturbance. I don't want it turning into something bigger than it needs to be. Ethan sat still, hands folded on the table. No one else in the diner had said a word about the dog. No plates had been pushed away. No chairs had scraped back in complaint. Mara had not moved from beneath the booth since she'd lain down there 20 minutes earlier. There was no disturbance in that diner, only a manager deciding one existed and describing it into a phone until it sounded true. 12 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser pulled into the lot, and Deputy Caleb Turner walked through the door with the bell giving its small, tired ring again. He was 34, built like a man who ran when he had time and skipped it when he didn't. Sunglasses pushed up on his head the moment he stepped inside. Ferris met him halfway across the floor and spoke low and fast, gesturing once toward the back booth. Caleb walked over, hand resting near his belt out of habit more than threat, and looked down at Ethan, then at Mara, who lifted her head calmly and looked back at him without a sound. "Sir, I need to see some identification." Ethan reached slowly into his jacket, narrating the motion the way he'd been trained to for exactly this kind of moment. "Wallet's coming out of my left side, nothing else." He handed over a driver's license, a military ID, and a folded set of leave papers he carried out of habit more than necessity. Caleb looked at the ID longer than he needed to. Senior Chief, Navy. The rank meant something to him, visibly, a small recalibration behind his eyes, though it didn't change what came out of his mouth next. He flipped through the leave papers once, folded them back along their original crease, and handed the stack back without comment on any of it. 18 years, he said, half to himself, glancing at the ID again before tucking the observation away somewhere it apparently wasn't going to matter. "Manager says you're refusing to remove the dog." "The manager's wrong," Ethan said. "She's a trained service dog." I explained her tasks. I offered to answer the questions he's legally allowed to ask. He wants more than that. "You got paperwork on her? Some kind of certification?" "There's no legal certification requirement," Ethan said. "I understand you might not deal with this often. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the law to apply the same way it would for anyone else. She's a military dog, though, right? I can see it in how she's sitting." "She was an Army explosive detection dog," Ethan said. "I adopted her through the military working dog retirement program after she came off active service. A civilian trainer evaluated her separately and spent the better part of a year retraining her for psychiatric work. She isn't a bomb dog anymore. She's my service dog now, and that's the only reason that matters in here." Caleb absorbed that, jaw tight, clearly working through something that didn't have a simple box to check. "I hear you," he said, "but I've got a manager telling me you won't leave, and I've got no paperwork confirming what you're telling me. Easiest thing is you step outside with the dog while we get this sorted." "What's the legal basis for that?" Ethan asked. Still even, still quiet. Caleb's hand drifted half an inch closer to his cuffs. "Don't make this into something it doesn't have to be," he said. "The owner's asking you to leave. If he formally withdraws permission and you stay, I have to look at trespass. I don't want to do that, but I will. A business can't create a lawful trespass out of a discriminatory denial of access," Ethan said. "That's not me being combative. That's just what the statute says." "That's a conversation for a courtroom, not a diner," Caleb said. "Right now, I've got a manager and a customer who disagree, and I need this resolved before it becomes something neither of us wants." The diner had gone quiet. A fork stopped moving somewhere behind him. Ferris watched from the counter with the stillness of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided in his favor. Ethan looked at Caleb for a long moment, weighing a hallway of consequences that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with math. A public argument over a legal technicality in a room full of strangers against an officer who had already made up his mind was not a fight that ended well for anyone, including the truth. "I'll leave," Ethan said. "I'm going to remember your name and your badge number, and I'm going to address this the right way, later, somewhere else. Not here." He set down his fork. He rose slowly, the way he did everything, and reached for Mara's harness. "We're leaving," he told her. Mara stood and took 2 steps toward the door, then she stopped. Her head dropped low, nose forward, and her whole body reoriented toward the kitchen corridor, with a suddenness that had nothing to do with obedience, and everything to do with training laid down years before Ethan had ever met her. The leash went taut in his hand. She pulled not toward the door, but away from it, past the counter, toward the narrow hallway that led to the rear emergency exit and the trash area behind the kitchen. "Hold on," Ethan said, and this time there was something in his voice that made even Ferris look up. Caleb's hand moved toward his cuffs. "Sir, don't start." She has an explosive odor, Ethan said. Give me 60 seconds. Caleb hesitated, eyes moving from Mara to Ethan, calculating in real time whether the story he'd walked in believing still matched what he was watching. The dog in front of him bore no resemblance to the animal he'd been told about 10 minutes earlier, and nothing about her behavior looked like theater. His hand dropped away from his cuffs entirely, and his voice changed before his expression did. Everyone, stay where you are and stay calm, he called across the diner. Nobody moved toward the back. An older man near the counter, silver-haired, unhurried, set down his coffee and stood. Ethan had noticed him earlier, reading a folded newspaper with the patience of someone who came in most mornings. Deputy, I'm Walter Hayes, he said. Retired fire marshal, 31 years. I've stood next to enough working dogs to know what a delay tactic looks like, and that isn't one. Whatever she's telling you, she means it. It wasn't Walter's word that changed anything. It was Mara's body, rigid and silent in a way Caleb had no training to fully explain, but every reason to trust once he actually looked at it. Mara reached the trash area near the rear door, nose dropping to the base of a liner pulled halfway out of its can, and sat, still, silent. Exactly still, the way she had been trained to be still years earlier, back when detection work was still her job. Ethan had never kept up her certification once she retired, and he had never used her operationally again. But an odor imprint burned in early enough, repeated often enough, doesn't fully leave a dog just because her paperwork says she's retired. That's her final alert, Ethan said. Passive sit. She's telling me something, and I'm not going any closer to find out what. I need everyone away from this area right now. From where he stood, several feet back with the leash gathered short in his hand, he could still make out the edge of something dark and taped, protruding from beneath the liner, and beside it a thin, irregular line that had no business being in a trash can. That was all he let himself see. He didn't step closer to confirm it. Everybody out. Front door. Now. Ferris blinked. What is? Front door, Ethan said again, and something in the flatness of his voice moved people out of their booths before their minds had fully caught up. Leave your food. Leave your bags. Leave everything. Walk, don't run, straight through the front, across the lot away from the building. Nobody uses the back exit. Nobody comes back in for anything. Emily was already moving, guiding an older couple by the elbow toward the door. Voice low and steady in a way that surprised even her. Walter held the door and waved people past him, out into the heat, farther across the lot than instinct told most of them was necessary. Keep going, he told a young mother juggling a car seat and a diaper bag. Past the tree line, not just the sidewalk, all the way, the two men who had been arguing about a football score left their plates half full and didn't look back once. The older couple by the window moved slower, and Emily stayed with them, one hand light against the woman's elbow, murmuring something steady that Ethan couldn't hear from where he stood but recognized anyway. The particular calm voice people found in themselves only when someone needed it more than they needed to be afraid. Caleb kept his hand on his radio now instead of his cuffs. Say that again, he said to Ethan. Say exactly what you saw. A wrapped cylindrical object with tape and a wire component near the rear trash receptacle, Ethan said. Neither I nor the dog touched it. She alerted from roughly 4 feet away and held her position. Caleb kept moving, but his voice into the radio had changed entirely from the voice he'd used walking in. Dispatch, I need fire, EMS, and bomb squad to Pine Ridge Diner, Route 9. Possible IED, unconfirmed, based on a trained detection alert. Buildings being evacuated now. He lowered the radio and looked at Ethan. I've got it from here. Get everyone across that lot and past the tree line. I'll handle the perimeter. Ferris hovered near the register, eyes darting toward the drawer, toward the back office. I need to grab the cash box, the daily records. Nothing in this building is worth someone going back inside for, Ethan said. Leave it. Ferris looked at him, then at the open door, then finally walked through it, hands empty. Outside, the parking lot filled with people standing farther back than they wanted to, watching a building they'd walked into for eggs and coffee 20 minutes earlier. Deputies arrived first, stringing tape across the lot's entrance, moving customers and staff back toward the far edge near the road. A second cruiser blocked the highway shoulder so no one could pull in behind the tape out of curiosity. Fire trucks staged a block away, engines idling, crews waiting in full gear for a signal that hadn't come yet. EMS units idled with their doors open, two paramedics leaning against the bumper of their rig, watching the building the way people watch something that might still surprise them. Nearly 40 minutes later, a state bomb squad vehicle rolled in, slow and deliberate, technicians moving with the unhurried care of people who had done this before and intended to keep doing it. No one ran, no one raised their voice. The pace itself seemed designed to keep the whole afternoon from tipping into panic. Ethan gave his statement standing at the edge of the tape, Mara sitting calm beside him. Leash slack now that her job was done. He described it the way he had been trained to describe anything that mattered. Chronologically, without embellishment, without claiming more certainty than he had. She showed early interest toward the rear of the building, maybe 15 minutes before the alert. I didn't act on it because it wasn't conclusive. When we stood to leave, her behavior changed completely, and she pulled toward the trash area on her own. She gave a passive sit alert about 4 feet from the object. I looked without touching. I saw a wrapped cylindrical shape and a wire component. Neither of us made contact with it at any point. A technician in heavy protective gear disappeared behind the building for nearly 20 minutes, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who understood exactly how much a single mistake could cost. A small robot rolled ahead of him at one point, camera turning toward the trash area while the technician watched a screen from a safer distance. No one outside the tape said a word during any of it. When he finally came back out, gear still half-fastened, he spoke quietly to his team lead, who then walked over to Caleb. "It's viable," he said, "capable of detonation. Nothing about it was an accident. If that place had been full at lunch instead of this close to empty at breakfast, we'd be talking about a very different afternoon and a very different number of names on a report." He didn't say how many. He didn't need to. Caleb exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that came from somewhere lower than his lungs. Investigators pulled the diner's security footage before the day was over. A man had entered nearly 40 minutes before Ethan, paid cash for coffee he never touched, walked toward the rear corridor twice under the excuse of using the restroom, and left without ordering food. A camera from a pharmacy 2 lots down caught the plate on his truck as he pulled out. Emily remembered him clearly once investigators asked. The flannel shirt, despite the heat, the way he kept his head down, the way he never once made eye contact with her when she offered him a menu. It took investigators the better part of a week to run the plate down through 3 counties, chase 2 dead ends, and finally arrest him at a motel off a different highway entirely. What emerged afterward had nothing to do with the diner itself, and everything to do with a job he'd lost there years before, a grievance he'd nursed long past reason, and threats he'd made to more than one person along the way. Some of those threats had been reported. Not all of them had been followed up on. None of that excused what he'd tried to do, and none of it had anything to do with the manager, or the deputy, or the dispute that had unfolded that morning over a service dog beneath a booth. Those were separate failures, smaller ones, that had simply happened to share a building with a much larger one. Ferris had no part in any of that, and Ethan never suggested otherwise. What Ferris was responsible for was smaller and entirely his own. Caleb found Ethan near his truck as the scene wound down, sunglasses off now, held loosely in one hand. "I owe you a real apology," he said, "not the kind you give because a camera's pointed at you." "Go ahead," Ethan said. "I let the manager's confidence stand in for evidence," Caleb said. "I asked you for paperwork the law never required. I turned a service animal disagreement into something that looked like defiance because it was easier than reading the actual statute. If your dog hadn't done what she did, I'd have walked you both out of that building, thinking I'd handled it exactly right." Ethan didn't tell him it was fine. It hadn't been. "Write it that way in your report," Ethan said. All of it. Not the softened version. "I will," Caleb said. And he did, word for word. His account wasn't the only one that mattered. Body cam footage, the dispatch recording of Ferris's original call, and the diner's own security video all went into the same file, and a supervisor outside his chain reviewed the whole thing against what Caleb had written before signing off on it. The report matched the footage. That was the part that counted. Ferris took longer to get there. His first attempt, delivered to Ethan outside the tape line, was built entirely out of the word misunderstanding, wrapped in concern about liability and health codes he'd already been told didn't apply. Ethan let the silence after it sit there long enough that Ferris eventually filled it himself. "I'd already decided you were trying to get away with something before I asked you a single question," Ferris said. Quieter now. "I used the deputy to back up a decision I'd made before he ever walked in. That dog never did anything wrong in my diner. I just didn't want to be the one who was wrong about her." "I appreciate you saying that," Ethan said. "It doesn't undo this morning, but it matters that you said it." The disability access complaint Ethan filed went further than a conversation between the two of them. It became a formal finding against the diner, a civil settlement Ferris paid out of his own pocket rather than the business account, and a 6-month compliance period during which an outside reviewer checked in on how Pine Ridge was actually handling service animal questions, not just what the posted policy said. Mandatory staff training came with it, along with a written note in Emily's file stating plainly that she would face no consequence, then or later, for having told investigators the truth about how her manager operated. Caleb's department added a service animal reference procedure to its training rotation, alongside a rule requiring supervisor consultation before any disability access dispute could be escalated toward trespass in the absence of an actual observed danger. Deputies were required to document the animal's actual observed behavior in any report touching a service animal complaint, not simply the caller's characterization of it. Caleb went through retraining and a period of supervised calls before he handled another one alone, and he didn't complain about either requirement once. That evening, Ethan sat at a rest stop 40 miles up the highway, engine off, Mara asleep across the back seat. He ran the sequence once, the way he ran through anything that mattered. Mara had given the first warning. Caleb had changed course before certainty ever arrived, which was harder than waiting for proof. Emily had guided strangers toward the door with a steadiness she hadn't known she owned. Walter had spoken instead of staying quiet. Ferris had finally walked out with empty hands. Mara had given all of them a warning. Every person after that had still needed to make the next decision correctly, and mostly that morning they had. He reached back without looking and rested his hand against her side until she settled. It was the same gesture he used 100 times a week, and it worked now the same way it always did on both of them. Several months later, the bell over the door at Pine Ridge Diner gave its same small, tired ring when Ethan pushed it open, Mara walking calm and low beside him. He hadn't come back to be forgiven. He'd come back because he wanted breakfast there, the same as anyone else. A laminated sign near the entrance said trained service animals were welcome, and that staff were required to ask only the questions permitted by law. Emily smiled before either of them said a word. "Booth in the back okay?" she asked. "I'll bring water for her if that's all right with you first." "That's perfect," Ethan said. Ferris nodded to him from behind the counter, asked once if the coffee was still too strong, then left them alone for the rest of the meal, professional and unhurried, no performance in it either direction. Mara settled beneath the same booth, chin on her paws. A cart rattled near the kitchen. Her ears lifted, measured the sound against nothing that mattered, and settled back down. Ethan kept eating. Her old training had explained the alert that morning. It had never been the reason she was allowed to lie beneath that table. That right had belonged to her before anyone in that building knew what she could detect, and it should never have taken an emergency for anyone to respect it. Did Deputy Turner handle his mistake responsibly once he realized how close he'd come to removing Ethan unlawfully, or should he have faced stronger consequences? Tell us what you think in the comments below.